Good evening. My name is Sid Schneid. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the first webinar that's going to be put on by the West Coast Coalition Against Racism, WCCAR, which will commemorate Black History Month by hearing from three speakers talking about being Black in Canada. Before we convene our panel, however, we're going to have a land acknowledgement from Prabjot Parmar, who is a professor of English at the University of Fraser Valley and a member of the WCCAR executive. Prabjot.
I respectfully acknowledge that I'm joining this meeting from this traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of Stalo, people of the river. The upriver dialect, Halkemelam, is the language that has been traditionally spoken here and has now been reduced to a very small pocket. And efforts are being made to learn Halkemelam by non-Indigenous, non-Stalo people. And I'm sure I'm not incorrect if I say that there will be some Stalo members who are also learning Halkemelam. So the language politics that historical racism has sent our way are very much constant. And when we are meeting to talk about Black History Month here in particular, and experiences and encounters that are directly or indirectly related to race or are race-based, it becomes even more important to talk about the experiences and history of the Indigenous communities in our own respective areas, wherever we are joining from in Canada. So in a collective voice, I would like to thank the Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers in various geographies where people have joined. And I particularly would like to thank Matsque Nation and Sumas Nation of Stalo Nation that are very much part of the geography where I live, work, and volunteer. So I raise my hands and show my appreciation to all of them. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prabjot. A bit about myself. I'm the vice president of the WCCAR, and I'm also a founding member of Independent Jewish Voices Canada, which is a national grassroots organization that opposes all forms of racism and advocates for justice and peace for everyone in Israel-Palestine. The WCCAR is a collective of organizations and individuals committed to providing education, support, and action in the struggle against racism and other forms of oppression. It follows in the footsteps of the BC Organization to Fight Racism, which was created in the 1980s in response to the threat of the KKK becoming established here in British Columbia. Black History Month is an annual celebration that started in the US in 1926. In December 1995, the House of Commons officially recognized February as Black History Month in Canada. Based on a motion introduced by the first African-Canadian woman elected to Parliament, the Honorable Jean Augustine. It's important to celebrate Black History Month because of the role of Black Canadians in their communities has been largely ignored as a key part of Canada's history. Few people in Canada are aware that people of African descent were once enslaved in the territory now known as Canada, or how those who fought enslavement helped to lay the foundation of Canada's diverse and inclusive society. Black History Month is a time to learn more about these Canadian stories and the many important contributions that Black Canadians and their communities have made to the history and vitality of this country. Now, over to Harinder Mahil, the president of the WCCAR, who will introduce our panel members.
Thanks, Sid. Before I introduce the panel members, I would request each one of you to mute yourself. I mean, I know that I can do it from here, but it's better that you do it because sometimes, we get distracted and there's some in the panel, of course, today's session is being recorded. So we have a great panel today. I mean, I've had the privilege of working with all three of them. Cal Brown is a published writer, an entrepreneur, an educator whose work with provincial governments, both in British Columbia and Ontario, as well as non-profit organizations and educational institutions are focused on training and education as a way to change lives. The double challenges of being a Black woman, Black and a woman, has given Carol a unique perspective on the world of work, the entrepreneurship, the necessity of pursuing higher education. She's lived experience and her lived experience in overcoming barriers that can block success. One of the favorite saying, Carol's favorite saying is, a rising tide lifts all boats, because she believes that improvement for one is improvement for everyone. She's hopeful that her grandson will not experience racism because, as grandmother Violet used to say, better must come. Again, I had the privilege of working with Carol at the BC Human Rights Commission. She's now coming to us from Ontario. So it's past 10 o'clock, past her bedtime, but I really appreciate her taking the time to be with us. Dave Lewis is a labor mediator, a practicing labor relations consultant, negotiator, facilitator, diversity and equity inclusion advocate. He's currently an employment relations officer with the Professional Institute of Public Service of Canada. This is a union where I worked for the last 18 years. David's education includes 2 bachelor's degrees, focusing on public policy, human rights, and equity studies, a postgraduate certificate in alternate dispute resolution, and a certificate in labor relations. He's currently pursuing his master's degree in interdisciplinary studies, focusing on equity studies through Athabasca University. David is passionate about social justice and enjoys volunteering within the community. Most recently, he sat on the board of directors of Pride Toronto as co-chair of the Advocacy, Equity, and Human Rights Committee. This is the committee that advises the Pride Toronto's leadership on current issues on social justice and human rights issues impacting the two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, and intersex communities. David's knowledge, life experience, and passion for helping others makes him a well-rounded and creative problem solver who seeks opportunities to make positive social impact. So last but not least, Anna Mohammed. She's a Vancouver-based lawyer whose primary experience and expertise are in the area of human rights, diversity, and employment matters. She has education, experience, and training as a lawyer, an adjudicator, a mediator, investigator, and an educator. Anna was called to Ontario Bar in 1992, and she has practiced as a lawyer in Toronto in the areas of criminal, civil, employment, and human rights law. She entered the Master's in Law program at UBC in 1998. The focus of her thesis research was sexual harassment or race issues. I've had the privilege of working with her at the BC Human Rights Commission. Of course, she mentioned that how she was able to conduct some research when she was at the commission. In 2001, she was appointed as a member of the BC Human Rights Tribunal, and she served in this capacity from 2001 to 2006. These members of the tribunal are adjudicators who adjudicate complaints of harassment or any kinds of complaints of filed with the tribunal these days. And in those days, it used to be complaints filed with the commission. Since 2006, Anna has been the principal of ARM Mediation Consulting, a private consulting firm that assists organizations in building better workplaces by providing employment, human rights, and diversity enhancing services to employers, unions, and private and public organizations. Anna is named in a number of collective agreements as a third-party investigator and mediator. She also provides educational workshops and sessions, group facilitation workplace assessments, and troubleshooting services to organizations whether it's unions or employer. She's also an adjunct professor at University of British Columbia Law School, where she teaches a course in human rights law. So once the three panel members speak, there will be a question and answer session where you will have the right to make interventions, whether it's a comment or question. Feel free to send your questions in the chat or raise your hand so you could be recognized. Sid will assist me in the Q&A session. Again, you'll be free to make comments rather than ask a question, but please be brief so that we can have maximum participation. With that, I'm going to call on Carol to make her presentation. Carol?
Hello, good evening, everybody. Thank you, Harinder, for inviting me into this space. I love these conversations. My day job is as diversity and inclusion lead with the Ministry of Health in the Ontario government. So I have these conversations all day. It's what I do. It's what I'm passionate about. Yeah, I'm excited about this conversation. So let me tell you a little bit about my story. And my story is going to be about belonging and where it fits into our conversation on being Black in Canada and around Black History Month. So I came to this country when I was 5 years old, born in Jamaica, surrounded by lots of friends and family, and then came to this country into a new family because my mother had remarried and had a couple of other kids. We arrived on a cold February day. I had never seen snow, so was in a little bit of a culture shock. You know, it was like, okay, what is this thing? And really was getting my first glimpse of white people. Had no clue what these people were and really thought that the snow had turned them white. So I was avoiding the snow because I kind of love the brown skin. You know what I mean? So I'm this 5-year-old kid and my mom takes us to our new place. We go outside into the backyard and the neighbors' kids are over there rolling snowballs and throwing them at each other. And, you know, being curious, I look over the fence and I'm like, hi. And the young boy on the other side says, look, and he says the N-word. He says to his whoever he's playing with, he says, look, it's a, and he says the N-word. And of course, I'm 5 and I'm new to this country. I have no idea what that word means, but I know that I felt like I had just been punched in the gut when I heard it. There was something about the tone and the way that he had emphasized it, like in all the other words. It just felt like a gut punch. So I didn't like that too much. So I went inside and I told my mom and I said, this boy just called me this thing. And I was a little upset and was expecting some comfort. And my mom said, so you are now in this country. This is not Jamaica. You have to learn to be tough. You have to lose the accent so that you're not different any more than you are just by how they look at you. She did not give me any other tools to deal with what I was going to face as a child growing up in this country. So a couple of days later, I go to school, 5 years old. I'm in, I don't know, grade 1, I think. And my teacher stands me up at the front of the classroom and she's introducing me to all the other students. And, you know, she says, everybody come up and, you know, shake Carol's hand and welcome her. Actually, at the time, I was using my first name, which is Charmaine. Not many people call me Charmaine, and you'll hear why in a second. So you know, they come up and they're very polite because the teacher's telling them, shake my hand. So one young man decides that he's going to be a little different and he licks my face and he says, ew, you don't taste like chocolate, you taste like dirt. Welcome to Canada. The teacher says nothing and we go on. Later that day, this same young man, he says to me, you actually look like poo. So we should get some Charmin to clean you up. And so they started calling me Charmin. Don't squeeze the Charmin. That was the taunt, right? Charmin toilet paper. So I went home very, very upset. And I said to my mother, told her what happened. And again, she said, this is going to happen. This is the country we're in now. You are a minority. You stand out because you have brown skin. She said, just, you have to get tough. You just have to Let you be like a duck. Let it roll off. Don't let it hurt you. That wasn't very good advice for a 5-year-old. So I went to school. This kept happening. This one particular boy would lead the taunts and lead the teasing and such. And then one day I snapped and I beat the living daylights out of this boy. I see Susan. Thank you, Susan, for the applause. My mother did not. She did not applaud. She did not applaud at all. She was very upset. I got suspended from school. And she said, you got to learn. You just got to learn to be tough and don't let it get to you. So I tried to fit in. I changed my name, stopped using Charmaine, started using Carol. And that's who I became, was this tough veneer, seemingly tough veneer. I got into a lot of fights over the years. So the other thing that I did was I got really quiet during that first year of school. I actually stopped talking for a while because I needed to listen. I needed to listen to the way that other kids spoke so that I could speak the same kind of English that they did. I was speaking Jamaican English, not the patois that you hear, but very proper Jamaican English because that's the family that I was raised in. It's also the reason why when I came to Canada, I didn't get put back a grade like the rest of the folks did because we were very, kind of upper crust in Jamaica. So I stopped talking so that I could hear how other kids speak. And then when I did speak, it was very much the way that they did. And I felt, okay, so I'm starting to fit in. Fast forward to high school. I have the majority of my friends are white, and I fit in with my white friends. I speak like them. I do the same things that they do. The high school has a very large Black population. I do not fit in with the Black kids. They say, oh, you're only Black on the outside. You're an Oreo. They say this. The white kids are going, oh, you're not like those other Blacks. You're so intelligent. You speak so well. And you don't dress like they do. And you don't listen to the same music they do. So that's what I got. White kids were like almost applauding me for not being that kind of Black. And the Black kids were going, why are you so white? So I was in this place in the middle where I just didn't belong. Wasn't feeling comfortable over there. Wasn't feeling comfortable over there either. So then I learned how to code switch. Now, if you don't know what code switching is, it is it's a term that's been coined by the Black people, generally speaking. It's the way that we switch depending on which environment that we're in. So when I was hanging with the Black kids, I was cool. I spoke patois. I listened to the music. I dressed the way they did. I did all the things that the other Black kids were doing. But when I was over there with my white friends, I was white. I was completely white. I listened to their music. I did all the things that they did. And then when I went home, I was finally me because I could be whoever that was, whoever I decided that was at the time. So code switching became the tool that I would use to fit into whatever environment that I was in. So we fast forward to work, the workplaces. I really mastered code switching when I went to work. I learned all the lingo. I learned all the way to dress, even my hair. Like even I shaved my head at a point just to not have to deal with the hair issue of, can I touch your hair? Can I feel your hair? Oh, it looks so soft. No. That is never okay. It's beyond a microaggression. It is never okay. I worked for the Ontario government, I think for 13 years now. I've watched lots of people come into the organization after me and get promoted over me. I've had to train people on how to do their jobs, but I wasn't good enough to do the job. So it was very hard to be in that space and watch these things happen. And when I went for interviews and wasn't successful, I would say, well, can we do like a debrief? I really want to understand kind of what I did wrong. And they said, no, Carol, you were great. You were fine. You were fabulous. The other person was just that much better than you. And I've heard that for 13 years until this position that I'm in now. So I finally, after 13 years, got a permanent position with the Ontario government. I interviewed last week for a position as a manager. We'll see. We'll see what happens. but it's hard for Black people in the OPS to get anywhere. We're running lots and lots of anti-racism programs now to try to kind of level the playing field, trying to change the way that we do recruitment. But Black people still do not feel that they belong in the Ontario government. There's been lawsuits against the Ontario government. There have been just a number of really unhappy Black OPSers that are really trying to change the system from the outside because they couldn't do it from the inside. They couldn't come to work and just be. The incidents of like physical harm were escalating. The incidents of the verbal abuse and the microaggressions, well, they've always been there. They haven't gone anywhere. They haven't gotten any better. We come to work and we try to belong as much as we can. We try to fit into the mold. It doesn't always happen. So when we talk about belonging, we talk about that feeling of security and support that you have when you go to work, right? It's about being accepted. It's about knowing that you can be whoever it is that you want to be, that you can be whenever you're at work. Employees don't feel like they belong. Their performances suffer. Their personal lives suffer. So it's crucial to us, to our life and our satisfaction, to our happiness, mental health, and our physical health, and even our longevity. We need that sense of purpose and meaning. And research has shown that the loss of belonging has been associated with things like stress and illness and decreased well-being and depression. So why wouldn't you want your employees to come to work and be healthy? Like, it's so easy to do. It's so easy to help people belong. You embrace groups, you build your friendships around individuals, but you remind yourself of the identity that you share with coworkers, and consider maybe joining or creating additional groups with your coworkers. Being a part of something and the cohesion and alignment between your goals and the group's purpose helps you to feel a better sense of belonging. And if you're authentic, then you can build trust and empathy, and you can be perceived as competent, right? You create the conditions for belonging when you're open and vulnerable, as well as when you are empathetic towards others. And colleagues can signal that you're accepted and help ensure that the people around them feel safe by asking questions, by listening, and demonstrating focused attention. They say that listening is the new superpower. And I think this is hilarious because my grandmother, who Harinder quoted earlier as saying, better must come. She has a lot of these great quotes. She used to say, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so you should listen twice as much as you talk. So if we can create belonging through physical closeness in the way that we used to, if we can't create it, physical closeness in the way that we used to, we've got to think about how we might create that through focused attention and listening. So creating these kinds of conditions contribute to our collective wellness and to investing in ourselves as well. So I'm going to leave you with a quote. Harvard-trained lawyer, cultural change catalyst, influencer, thought leader, social commentator, and author, Verna Myers, is quoted as saying, diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. And I've heard others add to this. And what I've heard is equity is being on the planning committee, and belonging is dancing like no one is watching. I hope we all get the chance to dance. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Carol. That's wonderful, personal account of what you've gone through in this country. Just great comments. I really loved it. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Dave Lewis.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome. So I'm going to work a bit backwards, starting with my current role at the Professional Institute.
Dave, you just went on mute.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, technology. I have to say, I worked at the OPS for just under 2 years. It was one of the most challenging places I've worked. I've seen employees break down in tears at work because of the abuse that they had to endure. And employees of color was more impactful, hurtful to me, being in a similar category and seeing how their emotions are just disregarded. When they express themselves, they are aggressive and rude. When they don't speak up, then too bad. Right now at the union that I'm at, a few years ago, I did an unscientific study. What I did, I researched the total number of unions in Canada. And I went on their website. There was roughly around 500, believe it or not. It's a lot. And I went on their website and looked at their presidents and their vice presidents and their directors, all the senior people up there. No Asians, no Browns, no Blacks. And it was really alarming. So then I did this workshop called the Paradox of Anti-Black Racism in Social Justice Spaces and Other Equity-Seeking Spaces. Now, someone asked me, why do you focus on Black only when other races experience oppression and racism? I said, because you know what? It is not my place to speak on their behalf. I have to stay in my lane. I can show solidarity, but I cannot speak for them. So I focus on anti-Black racism by just looking at how many people, Black people, are in the position of power in the labor movement. And the reason why I did that, because the labor movement is one of the most dominant advocacy organization or structures in our society. But within there, you find that there's a high level of oppression and exclusion. There's no belonging. Everybody's fighting, and you often find that it is the middle-aged white guy who is at the top of the food chain. And I am curious to know why that is, given the history of the labor movement. So I've been working with my HR department. There's a group of us, we called ourselves the DEI committee, where we're now training all members and staff on DEI and the importance of DEI. And that just launched, I believe, a few days ago. And we're doing other things in the background where we want to create an entire strategy, because it's really shameful that a labor movement, which is at the peak of social justice, has so much oppression within it and doesn't understand the importance of DEI and inclusion. So that's where I'm at right now, trying to do some work to change how these organizations function. And how did I get there? Oh man, like you, Carol, I've been told if I had a dog, I would name him my name, right? I was told, oh my God, I had dreadlocks. I was asked, oh my goodness, do you have bugs in there, right? One manager once said to me, I know you can be aggressive. Why are you being so passive? Because she was yelling at me and I refused to respond to her. I just sat there and kept my cool, because there's this stereotype that if you're Black, you're angry and you're aggressive and people need to be afraid of you, right? And they want to keep you in that box, or they want to trigger you so you can respond, so you feel what they think about you. I've gone into workplaces where a manager will say to me, that person smokes weed and went to jail, don't associate with them, a Black person, right? Trying to divide. And I question myself, how is all of this possible in a society that is saying it is multicultural and is inclusive? It's like this, they talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk. And I try to find ways of dealing with that. So from my way of pushing back is educating myself, right? So my first job in Canada, I got fired. I was very new, culture shock, very depressed. I went to my doctor and said, I am so dysfunctional, I can't work. I want to go back to my island. My doctor said to me, when you're in the island, what do? Go read a book. I'm not giving you a prescription for time off work, right? It didn't matter whether or not I was suicidal, because I just could not fit into society. But that was what I was told. I went to another doctor and I said to her, I'm depressed. I'm new here. I need help. She said to me, I need to refer you. Your situation seems complex, right? And I had to jump around trying to find doctors before I finally, and that is the experience a lot of minority groups, immigrants from the Caribbean, immigrants from wherever. And when we push back, the privileged don't understand why. They don't understand the hurt and the trauma that we went through, right? So as I said, for me, I educate myself and I fight back. So after being harassed, discriminated against, fired, I knew I knew a thing or two about the law. I joined the labor movement and I started studying labor relations and employment law. And it's not something that I'm proud of, but I'm still proud because I was no longer crying in the corner trying to get time off because I'm sick and stressed out. I was filing human rights complaints and I was winning every single one of them to the point where they stopped messing with me, where managers will come to me and ask me for advice in how to deal with other situations, right? So it's almost like the experiences have forced me to take on sort of like a cloak so I can protect myself, but I don't want it to stop there. How can I expand that to help others, to help other Black folks, to help other folks with disabilities, to help other racialized folks? Even in my job right now, I pretty much yelled at the manager today because they refused to provide an accommodation for someone 17 months in, still no accommodation, right? A colored person, a Black person. I say colored sometimes because I just mix them all in there, a Black person. And it's just really disheartening that this is a society that we're in that just advertise all of these good qualities and encourage people to come here. It's a land of opportunities. You're going to be so happy and it's going to be better. But people are suicidal when they get here because there's nothing what they expect. I've seen doctors driving taxis and they've had conversations with me, right? It is so hard for them to fit into this society. They drive a taxi or they work at a fast food restaurant. It's ridiculous. It's a systemic issue in Canada. I'm one person, but each of us has something that we can do. Educate yourself, understand how systemic racism and oppression works, and do what you can do. And most importantly, understand that even though you're one person, to somebody else who's struggling and don't understand and don't have the knowledge that you do, you are their world and you can save a life just by advocating for that one person. And I'll wrap it up there.
Thanks, Dave. That was wonderful. Just listening to the personal stories of yourself and Carol, just, paints another picture of Canada that you don't hear, you don't read in the press, you don't hear from just, ordinary white folks or those who are, dominant in our society. So with that, I'm going to ask Anna to speak. Anna?
Thank you, Rinder, and thank you to all to the organization for inviting me. I'm honored to be participating in this panel, and I've already learned so much. I am going to talk a bit about my personal experience, but I'm also going to talk a bit about the question that David asked: how does Canada, that prides itself on being a multicultural nation, we coined that phrase. We are considered to have one of the best human rights regimes in the world. When in my sort of adjunct professor role at the UBC, I get lawyers from other countries who come to Canada and they take my course specifically because they want to learn about human rights. And yet we do continue to struggle. So I am going to talk a little bit about that and specifically why race is such a tough issue for the system that was basically laid out in the 70s, and we're still using it to try and deal with a very complex and nuanced issue. So starting with my personal history, and I'll try to go through this quickly because I'm going to try to fit in more in my segment, but my family emigrated to Canada when I was 12 years old. And I have two brothers and a sister. The youngest of the four of us, my brother Neil, was 5 years old at the time. And like Carol, I remember stepping off. My dad had gone ahead to Winnipeg, to buy a house back then. And I'm going to talk a little bit about immigration policies in Canada and how that's changed and how that has helped change the face of Canada. But they came in under the business exception. So if you buy a business in Canada, you put in a certain amount of money, you basically get to hop the line. And I remember stepping off the plane, and I have this vivid memory of it. It was like walking into a wall of cold, and it was white, and the wind was blowing, and I was wearing sandals and no socks. And my dad had brought these blankets, and he huddled us up, and we went to Portage in Maine, which is notoriously one of the coldest corners in North America. And we went to the Hudson Bay Company, and the woman there sold us the ugliest coats. I looked like Cookie Monster. My sister had the same ugly coat and it was only later that I thought, there's no way anybody else would have bought that. But what do we know? It's warm. And I remember thinking to myself, oh, I must have really messed up. Like, I thought it was a punishment. I thought my parents had, I was a bit mischievous as a child. So, I thought, wow, I really crossed the line. And it was, in Winnipeg, and I've lived in Winnipeg, I've lived in Toronto, I've lived in London, Ontario, and I've lived in Vancouver and Coquitlam. So I've lived in 3 provinces and cities in Canada of different sizes, but I grew up in Winnipeg, and that's where I learned that I was Black. In Winnipeg, I was born in Trinidad. In Trinidad, there's a variety of ethnic groups. And quite frankly, at this point, it's like a jambalaya. I mean, this point, in Trinidad, there's a dish called pilau, and, it's a version of paella. When you kind of just throw everything in the pot and, it's amazing. So, the people of African, Indian, European, Chinese, Middle Eastern, Jewish, and Trinidad is actually one of the most diverse of the Caribbean islands. So the concept of identifying myself by ticking a box or, someone telling me this is really important, like identifying yourself in one of these, it was white, Black, other. And I am thinking, do I write an essay on the back? And at 12 years old, I get into the school system, and it was interesting. I sort of had, the reverse experience, because before that in Trinidad, I went to a private girls' school. So one of the great things about that, being female and going to an all-girls school, I didn't learn to wait till men had spoken, or that I couldn't put my hand up and say something. And that sort of presented a problem, because for my age, I was supposed to go to grade 7, and I was sort of putting my hand up and correcting how the teacher was doing the math. Because at that point, I was doing grade 10 science and math. And I got put into the guidance counselor's office because I was disruptive, and they didn't know how to deal with me. So I was there for 3 months, and they eventually skipped me and put me in grade 9. But, I had experiences in elementary and high school, it's very similar to some of the things, Carol, I think, racists can start being more imaginative, but I was asked, am I that color because I don't wash? I remember vividly walking down the school corridor. It was between classes. I was in grade 9. And I think at that point, everybody thought I was a freak anyway, because I was sort of sitting in the guidance counselor's office, and then I was in grade 9. And there was, and I still remember this person's name, but I'm not going to say it because this is recorded and I don't want to shame anyone, but he was on crutches, and he's now a police officer in Winnipeg, which is quite frightening. And he picked up one of the crutches. He balanced on the other one. He started making a machine gun sound and saying, "Rat-ta-ta-ta, shoot the end at the end of the hall." And I'm just puzzled by this. I have no idea I'm the end, and I have no idea what he's doing. And that was, I would say the most traumatic, because it was witnessed by a lot of people. And by that point, I'm old enough. One of the coping mechanisms I found is I have a very close-knit family, and there was 3 of us. And we would all, in the winter, we lived close to school, we'd walk home, and we would shield each other. We'd take turns, because people would line up and make snowballs and belt it at us and call us names. And so the 4 of us, in fact, to this day, we're all very, very close, because we had to become each other's best friends, because we didn't have any other friends. And I wonder what it's like for a person who didn't have 12 years of forming their own identity and being thrust into a place where you're assigned one, and certainly one that's not advantageous. And, that was very puzzling for me. In high school, I think the biggest thing in high school was, as every teenager, I wanted to fit in. I admire Carol, your courage. I wish I did punch a few people. And I admire David sort of standing up. I didn't. I just wanted to fit in so badly. And so I bought fashion magazines. I learned how to put on makeup, which, it's hard to do when all of the models in the magazine at that point were blonde hair, blue-eyed, and had straight hair. I tortured my hair. And even to this day, we see that. Like, if you look at dating apps, who are the ones that get, turned away the most, right? There's still that concept. And that was sort of my high school sort of experience. I mean, the best that I would get, which people I think thought was a compliment, was that I was exotic, like a creature of the zoo. At university, although I was just 17 when I entered, I got a Manitoba province scholarship. My mother's advice to me about what to do was, she says, you just can't put in 100%. You have to put in 150. You can't be as good as they are. You have to be better. Because of the color of your skin, they see you as lesser. So whatever you do it better than everybody else. And that was tough. That was tough to try and live a life beyond reproach, to always feel like you have to represent. So, that was hard. University, I remember an undergrad professor called me into his office to talk to me about a test result. And I was thinking, oh, wow, that's so nice and personal. And it was a 2-part exam. And the first part was multiple choice, and the second part were long answers. And I had gotten, 97% or something on the multiple choice, and he hadn't marked the long answer. And I soon realized, well, not soon, I was a little slow back then, because the whole concept of people treating me differently because of the color of my skin or where I came from, hadn't quite it took me a while. I think I was sort of in denial. And I realized that he was actually accusing me of cheating. I was a Manitoba scholar. I had 2 years of tuition fully paid. And so I don't know, did he look at it? Like, what did he look at? And sometimes, because race is a social construct, and we also know with intersectionality, I'm a woman, I'm a woman of color. I don't fit into any of the boxes, but I have been given one. And my last name's Mohammed, although it is not indicative of my religion, but my 14-year-old daughter, who has both the first name Ali and a hyphenated last name Mohammed, get started being stopped at the airport when she was 14 years old. And every single time they would tell her it was random. And as she got older, she got a bit cheekier. And she said to me one time, I don't think they understand what random means because I always get stopped. She was once told by an immigration officer that she should blame the person who named her. That's why this was happening. And, you think as you sort of go on to higher education that the ignorance decreases and that people will become more open-minded and they will see you, for your merit, for what you bring to the table. And I don't want to sound all negative. I also want to say that I did have people who were supportive, people who were white Canadians, who were my friends, who became my mentors. So I did have positive experiences. And I really do think that, initially my mom's advice, although it was hard to carry on, it did help me to a certain extent. It was like I had to make up for not being white. There's value in race, and my race has a subtraction to it. Whatever it is, they don't really know what it is, but they know it's something you're getting subtracted for. So then you just have to make it up by being harder working, being more accommodating, just trying to fit in. Law school, as a law student, it became a little more subtle, probably because people were learning about things like that. But I remember in law school, in your second year, you can apply to get a position as a legal student, but it's a really, really sought after position. It's not till the third year of law school, when you graduate, that you can become an articling student. And I remember I had gotten a position with the Attorney General's office in the civil department, which was a really, really sought after position. And in law school, you have small groups. You have groups of people that you go through school with. They're supposed to be like your law school family. And one of the people in that group, and I think it's why I remember it so much, because I really thought of him as a friend, said to me when I was excited to share the news with him, he actually said to me, well, that's great. I guess it doesn't hurt to be, a woman of color. At that point, I think, was when I started thinking, they're never going to accept you. You're never going to be good enough. So just be you. And, in that moment, I looked at him and I said, well, I don't know if that helped, but I think, because he had applied for the position as well. And I said, I think having better marks than you and having 2 law prizes up behind my name probably helped too. And, I think that's when I decided that the way I would fight back would not be physically. And one of the things about the law is it teaches you how society constructs systems to control, to oppress, to move forward their systems. And you need to know how they're constructed. For me, that was my niche, because if you know how it's constructed, you can work to deconstruct it. And through all of the means, there's advocacy, there's education, there's also representation, which is something that is really helpful. I know as a young lawyer in Toronto, there was a program where students, high school students, could shadow you for a day, see what a lawyer does, see what a hearing is like. And I would always ask for a person of color. Wasn't always granted. In fact, I don't think it ever was, but I put in the request anyway. At one of the big law firms that I worked at in Toronto, one of the senior partners, he kept mistaking me for someone in the typing pool, although they wooed me for weeks to take the position because I had offers from lots of law firms. And, I don't know if I should excuse him, but he was a very old man. At one firm party, he came up to me and he started playing with my hair. And he started telling me that he fly fishes. And could he cut off some of my hair? Because he ties his own flies. And it's just a perfect texture to catch those fish. Now, luckily, a young partner from across the room, I'm assuming this man who was a named partner at this firm had a bit of a reputation, sort of scooted over and sort of got me out of the clutches. There was one other a woman, Caribbean woman, who joined the firm as an articling student, and she and I became fast friends. And one time we were out for dinner, and I was telling her this story. And unlike me, something I really admired about her, she never tried to fit in. I mean, she had the hair that gave her 4 more inches. She was a tall woman. Like, she just owned it. I mean, she was a strong Black woman. And you could see the terror, because for me, I'm compliant, and you could see the terror on people's faces. So I tell her my little typing pool story and whatever. And she goes, yeah. And she names the partner, and she goes, he thinks I'm the janitorial staff. Last week, he asked me to empty his trash can. And then I said, okay, you win. So, it occurred to me at all levels. You meet with resistance. For me, the thing that kept me going was that I also found people who were supportive, people who could see past, the box that I was, going to be put in, and to see me, for me. And I think that those glimmers of hope, I think optimism is one of the highest forms of courage. To be optimistic in this world, being a person of color, takes courage. Interestingly, I have 2 daughters. They're biracial. Their father is Caucasian. And both of them pass for white. That is my worst nightmare. And it was about having biracial children, because once I claimed my identity, I self-identified and didn't let someone put me into a box. But for people who are biracial, all of the research shows you just try to fit in. And I remember being that teenager, I couldn't fit in. My older daughter, who gets stopped routinely because of her name at the airport, she dyed her hair blonde a few years ago, and she's very light-skinned. And when she was born, her eyes were even light. Actually, when I was on mat leave with her, I remember someone, we were out by the UBC, and it's a nice neighborhood, and people always assumed I was the nanny and spoke to me like I was. And I remember one time this woman coming up to me and saying, "Oh, little one, where do you live?" But she's not speaking to me. She's not looking at me. I'm invisible. She's speaking to my baby daughter. And so I just said, well, for 9 months she lived in here, got a little crowded, had to get out. So now we're on 15th. And, that for me is the kind of thing. I also use cartoon violence sometimes. I'm not a violent person by nature, but sometimes people just say such ignorant things. All you can do is think of a Bugs Bunny cartoon or, a Roadrunner, and some anvil is falling on their heads. It's like, okay, I don't need you to pull me into that negative space. You've taken enough. I'm not going to give you any more. And so becoming, as a lawyer, and when I went to do my LLM, I was able to practice criminal law, where I saw a whole nother side of the judicial system and race. I did a case involving 5 African-American men from Texas who were stopped at the Canadian border, and they were being tried of being terrorists. And I remember the prosecution side, I was on defense, asked if they could stay in our hotel because they assumed that our clients were going to blow up the hotel they were in. So they figured they wouldn't blow up the defense. So could they sort of stay with us? So it was interesting sort of seeing, for that case, we had to choose a jury, and they decided, there were a team of lawyers, there were 5 defendants, and they decided that we would challenge the jury about bias. And that was the first case in Canada or no, the second case, it was after R versus Park, where you got to ask a jury, a potential juror, something more than, are you biased or unbiased? And it was amazing to me. I think the strategy was, my last name was Mohammed. The 5 men were supposed to have been Muslim terrorists. And so I got to ask the jurors on the defense side a lot of questions. And my other lawyers were sort of looking for defense, like looking for, okay, do we want this person on the jury or not? And it was amazing to me how many people just out and out just said, yeah, I couldn't. Knowing these are Black men who are Black Muslims from Texas, no, I couldn't. They just, a lot of people, some of them just didn't want to be in a trial that was going to last, 2 months. But a lot of them, actually, that's how they felt. And so up until this point, and this was in the 90s, all we'd been asking people, are you biased or unbiased? And it sort of brings me to sort of the, why is Canada, a place that, we pride ourselves on multiculturalism? How are we still struggling with dealing with the issue of discrimination on the basis of race? And, it is across the board, the ground. So as I'm sure all of you know, the Human Rights Code has different grounds. And so there's race, color, ancestry, place of origin as one ground. And so why is that has been in play for so long? Why is that ground the one that is the least successful? If we define success as getting to a hearing and being successful or settling, and the complainant gets some type of damages from that, as compared to sexual harassment cases, where as a ground, it was relatively new. Yet the success rates there, and not just in BC, but sort of across the board, was much higher settlement rates. More cases were referred to a hearing, and then more of those cases were either successful or were settled. And, in going through, and I really was grateful to get the opportunity to do that research with the commission, because after that, the commission, clearly we've done with discrimination, so let's get rid of the commission. But in reading through witness statements, reports from the investigators, materials that the complainants would put in, when I'm looking at what witnesses would say about race complaints as compared to sexual harassment complaints, it was sort of clear to me why these cases weren't getting referred. Because, a lot of race complainants, their complaints seemed more unfocused, but it is because by the time they've gotten triggered to bring a complaint forward, they're looking at years and years of harassment and discrimination. And so the investigations would either focus on just the last incident or not see it as connected. Witnesses, for example, we were talking about a man who, a individual respondent who would use the N-word frequently to describe co-workers and, things like that. But, one witness, and I remember it standing out in that witness's information that was taken, the witness said, but it's not like he's like Adolf Hitler. It's not like, so the level to which a witness is willing to say, and it is because, as I look at the history of dealing with race in Canada, we've always looked away from it because we're not Americans, we're not racist. And Canadians are much more concerned about being called racist than doing anything about racism. Because if you don't name it, maybe it just goes away. Maybe it doesn't. And it was really interesting because I don't think for many of, the things that, the witness statements and things that I reviewed, I don't know how conscious, some of that was. And now, there are more subtle forms of discrimination. And when you look at things like implicit bias, there's a really interesting online test you can take to see what your biases are, where it flashes up pictures and then words, and then you have to press on one side or the other. when I first did it, I had a slight preference towards white people. It's very concerning to me. I was at the time married to someone white, and my children were biracial. And I'm thinking, how deep have I gone? Like, have I completely lost myself? One of the other things was that it wasn't just, the ongoing nature of race complaints versus sexual harassment complaints. I also think there was a more unified public awareness campaign. And oftentimes, consciously or unconsciously, societies will pit one race against another, a hierarchy of who is being discriminated against the most, or let's just deal with this right now, but we're not going to deal with that. And that is not, in my view, the way to deal with such a nuanced problem, because you're just putting a Band-Aid on. And it's not really helping anything. And it's also creating divisions. In my work as an investigator and as a mediator, when I was at the tribunal, I am sort of separated a bit from people, and half of my tenure at the tribunal was when there was a BC Human Rights Commission. There was a chief commissioner that was in control of that. There was a deputy chief commissioner that, assisted with issues that would have more of a systemic element, or that they could support the complainant. Because systemic cases are very, very difficult to prove. And even though the Supreme Court of Canada has lowered the bar for the kind of evidence you need in race cases, because we know people don't want to say, that person is racist. One of the other things I noticed about sexual harassment complaints and race complaints, it was, although nobody wants to be labeled either, it seems that people were more offended about being labeled as someone who engaged in racist behavior. And if you think about it, if for sexual harassment, if certain behavior occurs at a bar, or a nightclub or something like that, it is not particularly inappropriate, depending on the level of it. Whereas racial discrimination and harassment, certainly as a societal concept, is seen as very taboo. So other people, other witnesses, other people who witness this, they don't want to call it what it is. So it's something else. It's someone being too sensitive. It's someone playing the race card. The other thing about sexual harassment is that they had more allies, because everybody has a close relationship with a woman, right? Whether it's your mother or your sister. But if you are not a person of color, if you are not someone who's facing discrimination because of your race or ethnicity or color, I think it's harder for those people to put themselves in the shoes of someone, because it's not their mother or their sister who tends to look more like them. One of the things I challenge people to do is to say, what does your inner circle look like? You may be doing one thing at work, but who do you sit down with? Who do you laugh with? Who do your children, play with? I mean, when my older daughter was in, I think she was 5 or 6 years old, a friend of mine was getting married. And she was a lesbian, and we went to the wedding, and I was pregnant with my second daughter. And at that point, I hadn't quite realized it, but I had gone to 2 gay weddings and no heterosexual weddings, because I was old, and heterosexual people were given the right to marry a lot earlier. So my older daughter, was of the view that marrying a woman is completely normal. And I was not about to dissuade her from that. But I had the teacher speak to me, because apparently there was an incident at recess where my daughter was speaking about this, that her Auntie Mary had gotten married to her Auntie Pat. And, and I'm looking at this teacher, this is kindergarten. And I just kept saying, and I don't know, because I can be very polite if she got it, I just kept saying, I'm not really getting the problem here. Like, could you?
Can I ask you to conclude?
Oh, yes, sorry. So in closing, I would say, in terms of how to deal with these issues, I really think it's about each person finding a way to claim their own voice, to take action, and to actually see the problem as a societal problem, and to reach out to allies, and don't stay in the box that you're put in, and know that you have that support. and comfort rather than feeling I can't step on toes because that's not my box. And I don't know if everybody agrees with that, but my life, to date, it seems to me that that has worked well for me. Anyway, thank you all, and sorry to have gone over the time there.
Thanks, Anna. The best part of all three presentations was your personal experiences. It's we learn something every day, and I've learned from the three of you. Now it's our time to either comment or ask questions. You could do it either through chat or you could raise your hands and speak. And one person who's attending that I haven't seen for a long time is Wilma Clark, who I had written to at one point asking her to be on the panel, and she just was away, didn't answer my email. Wilma, you want to make a comment? Or maybe she's left. Yeah, I think so. Okay, anyone, please feel free to raise your hand or ask questions. And Sid is going to be helping me with this part.
There's Jean.
I just wanted to thank all the speakers. I guess it's a sign of how bad racism is that as a white person, I've never experienced all of the personal situations that you described, right? I can't imagine what it would be like to have to experience that and come out of it as, in such a good way like all of you have. So I just wanted to thank you for talking about that and helping the rest of us understand. And I hope I can be strong in fighting against racism. And if there's anything I can do, let me know.
Thanks, Jean. We need voices like yours in city councils, in legislatures, and in parliament. Thank you for your comments.
Jana asked the question. She says, I've heard a lot of Black Canadians express that they have experienced disproportionate anti-Blackness from people of color, especially Asians. I wonder if this is your experience or if you could speak to that.
I'd like to jump in there, if that's okay.
Sure.
In forums like this, I generally don't like to speak about the or what I call intra racism, because it sort of serves to like divide the already marginalized groups. But what I would say, it's one of those things where you almost competing for scarce resources. That's how best how way I can put it. We all trying to get to that place of equity and inclusion and belonging, and it's if you have limited resources and an infinite need, it just doesn't measure up. So until we dismantle the systems that oppress us and really truly work towards multiculturalism and inclusion, then we're gonna find ourselves in situations where we're trying to say, oh well, the Asians don't like the Blacks, or the Blacks don't like the Asians, or the Browns don't like this, and then it becomes we take it away from what it really is that we here as oppressed groups are trying to find equity and inclusion among the people who are in power, and often it's the white folks.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on that too. Thanks, Dave. For me, it's about that saying, right? A rising tide lifts all boats. So if we improve things for the Black community, everybody benefits. I think about the sidewalk cutouts that they have that were originally designed for people in wheelchairs, right? So that they could roll up to the sidewalk and not have any issues. Everybody benefits from that. Women in strollers, or parents with strollers. If you break an ankle, like everybody benefits from that. And that's how I see equity. That's how I see this whole struggle, is if we can focus on one group, which, and I got to say, the house is on fire for Black people, right? The house is on fire. So if we could deal with that fire, then the rest of the houses don't have to worry about burning. That's what I want to say about that.
If I can add one comment to that as well. I think the divide and conquer strategy is used because if you create that infighting, they'll just fight amongst themselves as to whose need is greater and who should be ahead. And, when I looked at race cases and I looked at sexual harassment cases, one of the benefits of the sexual harassment cases was it had this momentum because it had numbers. Women are the only majority that is, treated like a minority. And so I do think that work can be done. And I'm a big advocate of doing that work early on in elementary schools and high schools, because I have seen that growing up, and I have done those talks in my kids' schools. And, the responses that I have gotten, even from kids in grade 6 and 7, has been amazing. But I do think that we can take from the labor movement that idea of solidarity, and that justice for one is justice for all. And if we can do, because that strategy of dividing and conquering works. It works really well. And, in investigations that I've had, in mediations and in tribunal cases, there are, cases of that racial. And I wish that there could be more education on that, so that it doesn't distract us from that bigger problem, because, it will always be, if I'm on the other side of the argument, being devil's advocate here, I would utilize it. It's a good strategy, and then you get people fighting amongst themselves, and then you don't have to do anything. So I do think that, that's an issue. I know myself personally, I sometimes get greater pushback, certainly from men who are of, different ethnic groups, because I am a woman and maybe in their culture, and, who do I think I am? And, and that's sometimes harder for me to deal with, because I don't know why, but I'm not expecting it. I feel like we're all in this boat together. So let's row in unison. But that is a big effort to coordinate that. And I think that forums like this, and advocacy work in getting people to understand and to see from other perspectives or commonalities, rather than sort of that hierarchy, is helpful.
I'm wondering if the panelists have questions of one another.
I actually had a question for Dave, because you touched on something on intersectionality that I thought was really interesting, in terms of how mental health issues may be addressed. Women get that in terms of how we're diagnosed and prescribed, and much more so than men. But I think it's interesting, as a man, you're not getting the treatment a white man would get if he raised a mental health issue, right? Because if a white man's raising it, it's a problem. If a woman's raising it, maybe she's just hysterical, or it's that time of the month, and if a visible minority is, they're just weak, or they can't take it, or they're overly sensitive. So I thought that was an interesting lens. Was there anything more that, you wanted to say on that?
Yeah, just briefly. So I will always look as there's this chart that we used once in a workshop where it was a privilege. We call it the privilege scorecard, and I also use it for intersectionality, where I have one column as oppression, and we check all of the boxes that you might fit into to see who has the most check boxes. It's a silly way, but you get to see. It's not where this is the one time more is not better, right? It's more oppression. So you're Black,
Mhm.
you're a member of the LGBTQ plus community, you have a
Mhm.
disability,
Mhm.
right? You're an immigrant.
Mhm.
All of those things fit in. So you're already getting discriminated against by your skin color.
Mhm.
Then you add to that being oppressed or discriminated against because of a disability. You add to that, I have people constantly ask about my accent. And before I was so embarrassed by it that I would try to speak like a Canadian, the worst thing ever,
Mhm.
right? I can't do that. So at some point, I just gave up. All I say to people is if I speak too fast, tell me to slow down. It really came home to me last week when I said to my manager, this person is so rude. When they said to me, I can't understand what you're saying. I think this case is better suited for this person. And this was a white person saying this to me, a Black person to another white, giving it to another white person, right? And I'm looking at all of that and I'm saying, my, oh my, even my accent is a problem for people. They don't want to take the time to listen.
Mhm.
You have to fit your speech pattern into a manner that they could understand. Otherwise, you're not good enough. So I have all of these things in my bag that I can't take to the bank, right? And more or less taking them to the cemetery where I can bury them because they're all stressful, right?
Mhm.
And that's the easiest way I can explain this and how all of those identities intersect, not to make me better off in this society, but how they oppress me. And each one I get pushed deeper into the abyss, right? So that's the easiest way I can explain that.
Mhm.
I love that, Dave. I do. I do an exercise with the folks in my ministry. I call it social inclusion, and it is all about intersectionality. So I pull out the wheel, and I'm like, I want you to plot yourself on this wheel, and then let's talk about it. And the silence, like when the white folks do it, the silence, because then they get to visually see
Mhm.
their power and their privilege compared to the racialized people that are in the same session, and they finally get it. When I do that exercise, they're just like, oh my god, oh my god. And it just helps them to kind of slow down, stop, and think about where they are and how they move in circles where there are people of color.
Stephanie says, I'm curious about how we can fight against racism in the labor movement. As Dave mentioned, the leadership in labor unions is predominantly white. I wonder if the panelists could comment on steps we can take to tackle racism, especially through solidarity.
Well, if you're like me and have nothing to lose at this point, you're going to confront it head on. But over the years, I've learned to be measured in my approach. Just because I've experienced so much in terms of people saying, oh, you're 6'3", you're intimidating. Or somebody said to me, you're a tall Black man. I was actually when I was at OPS, there was a disruptive person at the front desk, and one of my coworkers came to me and said, oh, come here, we needed to do something. And they walked me out to the reception area and just said, stand there. And then when I got back inside, they said, oh, well, look at you, you're tall and you're a Black man. Nobody want to mess with you, right? All of that experience to where I'm at now, whenever I go into an organization, I look at their equity diversity statement. So one of the things I did when I interviewed for my current role at the union, I said to them in the interview, as you can see, I'm a Black person, I'm a member of this community, and please put that in your decision-making process. I was surprised when they called me the next day. They said, I appreciate your honesty, right? Because I was just tired of having to hide who I am. So once I got in, the first thing I did was look at how I could contribute, not to necessarily fight, because you want to build bridges sometimes. So in that short space of time, we had, I believe, not anti-Black racism training in my team. Now we have a corporate strategy being worked on. I'm not responsible for that, but I got pulled on to that team because I'm just really passionate about it. And it's just bringing everybody together so that they can learn in a formal and informal way. And just today we had a Black History Month event again that we coordinated. really it's about educating people in the movement, and how even as a social justice movement, there's still issues ingrained in it. And that is actually the focus of my master's studies in the university, is what is it? What is the experience of racialized people in the labor movement? And how is that similar or different to what we actually fight for with employers? And when I looked at it visually, there's no difference really. And something has to give, because that's really paradoxical if you ask me. So sorry to answer the question in terms of solidarity, there's a lot to do with education. And we have to be measured in our approach. I believe that before I was very militant. I'm tired of you. You've hurt me too many times, I'm gonna fight you. But now I'm using that experience to educate people on how they can partner with me to make it better for everyone else.
Thanks, Dave. The issue about unions, we have to do two things. One is confronting. I see unions where vast majority of membership is immigrant, non-white, and the leadership is white. So you have to confront. At the same time, we got to educate the membership that you have to start taking the role, the leadership role. Why is it that the vast majority of the members are non-white and the leadership is still white? We got to do both. It's extremely important that we work with membership and just wake them up and ask them to understand their rights and start exercising those rights.
And I completely agree with that education, and I offer unions that I work with a lot to do sessions with their leadership, because it is oftentimes a top-down issue. And what I have seen in conflict, because employment law is an area of the law that I practice, and I've practiced both on union side and management side, which is unusual here, but not in Toronto where I did it. And the concept of seniority is so important to unions, and certainly and to some extent that can compete with the issue of diversity and merit, because there were times when women would just not be considered for the position, or a person of color would not be considered in that profession. And now coming in as a less senior person and sort of trying to get those folks more diversity throughout can be an issue. And it is a very sensitive issue for not just the membership, but the leadership, in terms of how do we sort of work with and respect both of those things. The pendulum has swung one way, and usually before we get right back to center, it has to swing the other. I have some of my clients now who the employer and the unions on collective agreements that I'm named on will ask me to sit in on interviews. And the union will agree and the employer will agree that they will consider, diversity. I had one, I do a lot of college university sector work. I'm on their umbrella agreement, and I've had to sit in on those, because even as they're hiring, if they don't have the diversity in the leadership, and there is a difference in learning something in a book and having a lived experience, there is a difference. And so having those sets of eyes, I've heard from the clients that it's really beneficial that I can raise things or question things, and things like some of those things you guys have talked about, how is an accent or soft skills going to be the reason? How are you scoring that? I'll have people comment on they like the way someone was dressed, which can also be, have all of these other dimensions to it. People like people who are like them. Tall bosses hire tall employees. Short managers hire shorter employees. I mean, all of the research shows that. So if the leadership looks a certain way, that's who they're going to gravitate to. Even advertising, telling clients to advertise in places where there are more diverse populations and different languages. So I think that, we start, it's top and bottom and middle, and just sort of all working to increase that diversity. But for the labor movement itself, I think that they are becoming a leader in inclusion, and they are looking at those roles more closely. But there's always going to be, people giving up something they weren't entitled to. They somehow still think they're giving up something. Well, you never should have had it in the first place. So, if I bring you a cup of coffee every day and then I stop, you can't go, you owe me coffee,
I liked what you said about the pendulum swinging, Anna, and for not just for that question, but there's another question in the chat about Black elected representatives. And I think that is an issue of pendulum swing as well. I think that when we had folks like Emery and Rosemary, there was a climate for it. People were hungry. People wanted it. They liked what they were saying. They liked, their political direction. And I think that the pendulum just swung the other way. And I mean, I think right now we have more Black people, up on the Hill than we've ever had. So that's a definite move in the right direction. I don't know what BC's doing. I don't know what you guys are doing out there on the West Coast. Why you're not electing Black people, but get on it. Next election's coming up. Let's go.
Thanks, Carol. I think I promised everybody that we were going to be out of here by 8:30 BC time. So it's coming up to that, and I'm going to call Karan Prabjot to conclude the session. Prabjot?
Thank you, Virendraji. On behalf of all the people who have joined us and West Coast Coalition Against Racism and its members, I would like to thank Carol Brown, Dave Lewis, and Anna Muhammad. Just by saying thank you, sometimes this was the kind of thank you I really wanted to be there in person. So in conflagration of COVID restriction, I send you a big hug to each one of you. And Dave, I'll have to stand on my toes. I'm used to that. My brother is 6'4", so it's been 2 years since I have been home. So I'm looking forward to doing that. So in absentia, I've done that with you. So this is a very heartfelt thank you because what you have talked about is not going to be switched off after we leave, after we sign off from Zoom, perhaps for some, but not for many of us. So thank you for sharing some very painful, very sad parts of your life that have led to your, sadly, building of your persona and your everyday life. So deep gratitude to all of you. And I'll again go back to my Indigenous learning here, that the notion of all my relations that I often share with the colleagues in meetings, as I am learning from my Indigenous colleagues and students and community members, that all my relations, which initially I thought maybe it is related to that specific community where it is being said. However, it is much wider and broader. It is universal, as many of you, possibly all of you would know. Nevertheless, I will say it out that it links not just a community, but people within a community and community to others. So people to people and to animal and flora and fauna. So we are linked, so in that sense in that spirit, I say all my relations, and I say thank you to each one of you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It was wonderful to see you all. Thank you.
Good to see so familiar faces.
Thank you for organizing this. Thank you so much. Bye.
Good night.
Bye, everyone. Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.
I
Idea.